I ate mashed potato out of a dog bowl.
What is this, Isaac?
Hard to resist. We've come for a pint.
Hello me old fruit, how you been? And welcome back to A Thing of the Past. Today we're going back to the turn of the 18th century when the constitutional monarchy of Britain and the newly reformed Republic of France clashed in the Napoleonic War. This conflict led to the housing of French prisoners in nearby Ashby De La Zouch, which actually takes its name from a French nobleman who was awarded the lands by William the Conqueror. As you watch today's episode, think not only of the physical conflict, but the conflict between the ideals of love, brotherhood, nation, and class. And are these ideals stronger than the environment we find ourselves in? We hope you enjoy the episode.
We start our journey today at Ashby Castle. Plenty of famous owners, namely the Hastings family and Francis Rawdon, who was the owner at the time of the Napoleonic Prisoners of War, arriving here in Ashby. Rawdon had been in America in the War of Independence, then served in the Napoleonic War and later became a commissioner in India.
What a dump. Really, what a dump. I mean, this has been like this for 400 years. I was a student, I ate mashed potato out of a dog bowl. So I've seen some dumps in my time, but I don't think any student could leave a place like this for 400 years.
The castle ended up like this during the English Civil War in 1648. There was a big siege. Royalists held the castle. The parliamentarians were camped at Culloden Hall. The siege lasted for just under a year. Eventually, the parliamentarians captured the castle, slighted it, looted it, and left it like this. By the period we are discussing today, Britain was no longer at war with itself. The country had reached a state of unity under a newfound love for national patriotism. Earlier patriotism was originally segregated by class, meaning people were patriotic for their peerage or their agricultural class, or the workers, for example. Later, William Pitt the Elder transitioned patriotism to be about the nation. This meant the country could go to war with France as a united one. The French wars had been raging on since the French Revolution of 1793.
That went up to 1802, there was the Peace of Amiens, and then after that, Napoleon re-invaded Spain, and that started off the whole war again.
When we think of traditional prisoners of war, we picture perhaps the captured soldiers of World War I or World War II, trapped in a camp surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and angry Alsatians. We picture them conserving their energy for a big breakout with nothing but a rusty spoon.
But for the prisoners in Ashby, because they were of a certain class, they were basically allowed a parole. So today what would be like being on tag. So as long as they stayed within a mile of the town, were in by their curfew, and were on good behaviour, they were free really to do what they liked.
In this period, the steam engine had just been invented. However, market towns like Ashby were reliant on natural resources, and for cost, these were used when possible for many years to come. To the west of me, at the bottom of Kildwarby Hill, runs a stream that ran a lace mill, and on the hill to the south was a windmill right into the 1840s. We've now walked along the castle boundary to South Street to visit another building that was present during this period.
So we're now outside the modern day living rooms. At the time of the Napoleonic prisoners arriving, this was a pub called the Wagner and Horses, or Osses. Basically at that time, pubs used their names to indicate the sort of clientele that ate there, drank there, stopped there. Wagner and Horses indicating that it was for travellers, people who were travelling through, probably on the Leicester to Burton Road. Here you can see that it's also a Freemasons' lodge now. The Napoleonic Prisoners of War, many of them established lodges of the Freemasons in the town, joined lodges. They built chairs for the lodges, and also some of them took them back to France. So with the groups that they created, the names obviously indicated the French idea of liberty, fraternity, so they were called the Lodge of Justice and Peace, things like that, which were different to the British lodges that were still enforcing the idea of the monarchy and the crown.
We now come to St Helens Church on the boundary of the castle. It is also one of the town's oldest buildings. Interestingly, after the Battle of Waterloo, the prisoners were free to travel back to France, but a few of them chose to stay. They married here, built families here, and one of them is even buried in this churchyard today. We looked tirelessly for the grave, but the headstones are in such poor condition that I'm afraid to say we came to a dead end. Another interesting fact we found when we were researching St Helens is that the ringing of the bell actually rescued a man who was lost in the wilds of Moira. Every night they would ring the bells as a curfew to let the people know to vacate the streets or to go to sleep. At this time, of course, there was the risk of bears and wolves, as well as thieves and later highwaymen.
And the man obviously donated money to build houses in Moira that were called Daybell houses. And to this day there's actually a road in Moira called Daybell Road. That also happened quite common. It was happened in Market Harborough, also Blaby, and there was a woman who was once lost in a snowstorm out Rutland Way, and she was also saved by the ringing of the bell. We're now leaving St Helens Churchyard, and we're going to take a walk that the French Napoleonic Prisoners of War were allowed to take as part of the conditions of their parole. This meant that from the centre of Ashby town, they could walk wherever within 1 mile radius.
The walk we are going to do today goes through Mount Walk, down Lower Packington Road, over the A42, across the fields known as the Frenchman's Walk, then back up Leicester Road, past Ashby School, and finishing back at St Helens Church, just as the prisoners would have done time and time again. As I walk along Mount Walk, I note the trees planted by Francis Rawdon's children. They were planted in 1811, and it still amazes me that they're here today.
So we're still on Mount Walk here. Obviously, a bit of a confusing name. I mean, you can imagine, England's at war, you've got a message from the King, the parliamentarian forces are on their way. You've raced it through the night on your horse, you've been riding day, night, wind, gale. You've come dashing up here, trying to get a message to Hastings. They're on the way. And then there's a sign, Mount Walk. I mean, do you stay on your horse or do you walk? It's those sort of things, you know, you've got to think.
We now leave Mount Walk and head over the A42, bringing us very close to our 1 mile radius.
So we're now coming off the main Packington Road, joining the footpath that will take us across to Leicester Road. What's interesting is we're now exactly 1 mile from the centre of Ashby, which means that it was this point where the prisoners would have to cross the road to remain within the boundaries of the parole.
This was the point specifically known as the Frenchman's Walk. There are a number of footpaths running across these fields, but because of the 1 mile radius, this was where they had to cross to Leicester Road. We are being led parallel to the 42. Of course, this wasn't here at this point.
Another reason why the prisoners would leave the town centre was to take part in duels. On December 1808, a farm labourer found the body of a Captain de Neige in a field near to Packington. His body was still warm and he had taken off his waistcoat as it had not been pierced by the sword. Another example of this was Captain Colvin, who was actually buried in Packington churchyard.
Prisoners would have strolled along this very route numerous times throughout their residence in Ashby De La Zouch. They would have brought women to court, instruments to play, and picnics to eat under the shade of the trees. As beautiful as it was, and still is, I can't help to think that when you're only given a mile radius, this walk would become quite monotonous over time. I now leave the Frenchman's Walk and head back to St Helens Church along the Leicester Road. I pass under the railway bridge that was originally part of the Ticknell Tramway, which operated from 1802 to 1913 and was used primarily to connect the lime quarries of Ticknell with the Ashby Canal. Having completed the walk, I think about how that was only one of the walks the prisoners would have taken, and I want to see some more.
So, as I previously said, we're now going to take another route that the Frenchmen walked. Instead, hard to resist, we've come for a pint. But the reason we're coming for a pint is this here. Now, this mantelpiece is reputed to have been built by the Napoleonic Prisoners of War during their time in the town. It wasn't originally in the pub. As you can see here, we've got this arch which is quite reminiscent of one of the Ashby school buildings on South Street. Basically, during the time in the town, the French prisoners of war received an allowance from the British government But to supplement that income, they also worked and they also made things using a trade that they would have learnt at home. So this man here obviously probably worked with wood, could have made mantelpieces before he joined the French Navy or Army. Other things that they made, they used animal bone, they made working constructions of guillotines, models of ships, dominoes, and this here obviously is a prime example of what could be done with the skills that they had.
We now leave the pub and Ashby itself in search of an old abandoned railway tunnel. The Old Parks Tunnel was part of the Ticknall horse-drawn tramway we spoke about earlier. The prisoners themselves travelled through the tunnel many times. With a couple of wrong turns and dead ends, we eventually managed to find the remarkably well-concealed Old Parks Tunnel.
We're now here at Old Parks Tunnel. The Napoleonic Prisoners of War, coming a mile out of Ashby this way, would have passed under this tunnel, probably on the way to picnic or something out here in the Old Parks. Obviously called the Old Parks because the Ferrers family owned big hunting lodges all the way Staunton Harold, Cork Abbey. It was all traditional deer parks. The story goes that when the French prisoners came on the cart up to the tunnel, the violin player stopped playing his violin as they went through the tunnel. Obviously, perhaps he couldn't play his violin in the dark, or there was something more promiscuous going on. Who knows? So we're now inside Old Parks Tunnel. Obviously the end has been shut off, so it's very cold in here, very dark. The track bed used to run through here from Ashby. I think that the tunnel was a tramway to start with, and then with the invention of the railways, the railway then ran through here as well. You have no idea this is here from the road or from Google Maps. There's a few leaks in places, but you can generally see the run of the old track bed.
What is this, Isaac?
Well, here we've got the rivets, which would make you think this was attached to something else. Obviously, it's the shape of a wheel, whether it was the cover of the wheel. Maybe it's a modern item, I'm not really sure. So, we've now reached the end of the tunnel. Behind this brick wall here, it's completely blocked off. Then they've poured cement in, and obviously it sends up towards the exit. We're now going to walk back down the tunnel, back towards Staunton Harold Way. There's a few bricks down here as well, NCB Watnell. Presume that's the National Coal Board. Maybe that pit was shut and they were brought here to brick it up. Yeah, how times change, you know? How times change.
A thing of the past.
A thing of the past, man. So we're just on our way out of the tunnel. Obviously when we came in, we weren't really looking up, but we've noticed up there, if you can see it in the darkness, it looks like some sort of signal. There's one over this side as well. And obviously, due to the end of the tunnel being there, that does make sense. Perhaps trains had to wait, get permission to go out, or yeah, maybe, I don't know, if there was some sort of problem out on the other side of the tunnel, the train would have to wait.
Leaving the cold, dark, wet tunnel, I noticed one more point of interest just outside.
And we've come across this thing here. Don't know specifically what this is, but on top you've got a manhole cover sort of device, and inside sort of like a bowl. That would suggest some sort of water system. Perhaps when the trains went through the tunnel, they had to reduce their steam. When they came out the other side, they had a top up of water to take them on to their destination. So we've now seen the end of one of the other prisoners' walks that they did. What we're going to do now is we're going to go over to Willesley.
We arrive at what is now Wolseley Campsite. At the time, this was owned by the Parnell family, but by marriage became the home of Charles Hastings. Charles Hastings, after serving in the American War of Independence and the Napoleonic War, eventually ended up taking his own life. Due to spending much of his life in Britain's wars, we can presume that he was suffering from PTSD. Upon his death, he requested that acorns be planted over his grave so that he may have the satisfaction of knowing his body would serve to rear a good English oak, the essential ingredient in British galleons. However, before his death in 1823, he was present at the ball which provided the backdrop for the French prisoner of war, General Lejeune's escape.
So we're now at the Church of St. Thomas in Wolseley, what is now Willesley Campsite. This, of course, at one time was Willesley Hall, which in this period was owned by Charles Hastings, good friend of Francis Rawdon, who we mentioned earlier. Charles Hastings used to hold big dinner parties, and of course the French officers, they were invited to come as well. Now Francois Le Zouch, who was a general, a baron and a painter, he was invited to one of these parties, and he'd been in correspondence with a man who had moved to England in the 1760s, who knew a French wine merchant. He had told Francois Le Zouch that he could make good his escape. So after a party here, Francois Le Zouch headed out, saying that he had to get home for his curfew, and hid in a bush. After about an hour, he recognised the man who was the wine merchant, and within a couple of minutes, he was on a stagecoach on his way through Northampton to London. When they arrived in London, they then had to make good their escape on a boat, and they were told that if they disguised themselves as older, invalided soldiers, it would be easier for them to get out. They did this, and Francois Le Zouch returned to his home country of France.
Whilst exploring the outside of St Thomas's Church and what was once the grounds of Willesley Hall, we met Adi, the site warden, who was more than happy for us to explore the history here, and even showed us inside the church, which contained the crypt of the Hastings family. Adi then directed us to a website called Britain from Above, which has photos of Willesley Hall taken in 1936 before its eventual demolition in 1953. Adi told us that on the right day with the right conditions, you could actually see the old hall's foundations. As we flew up high, as the light aircraft would have done for the photos in 1936, I began to think about the lives that would have been lived here and all of the history that would one day be inevitably lost and forgotten, like the old hall itself. I think about how Francois Le Zouch must have felt as one of the many prisoners confined to Ashby. On the one hand, yes, they were prisoners, but perhaps not by the same standard as today. I acknowledge that of course they were of higher rank and therefore treated a lot better than the common prisoner, and yes, individuals would have had their own outlook on their situation. But if some of them chose to stay and build a life here, perhaps Ashby had something to offer them that they felt was more appealing than what lay back in France. And perhaps Ashby De La Zouch has more history running through its veins than I was originally taught at school. This was just the first of many episodes where I delve into our local history and I find out more information about the lives that have been lived throughout our local areas. I hope you join me on this journey to a thing of the past.